Going to welcome our third speaker, Klamert.
Thank you.
Change it did. Yep,
It did.
there you go.
Oh, fantastic.
15, just for 2 more
Perfect.
minutes.
I go right for...
Yes, that one moved you on.
Okay,
It goes
perfect.
back.
Oh, fantastic. Hi, everyone. Now, looking at all the other speakers before me, it felt like no one of them were nervous, so I'm quite nervous. I would like to start off by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and families of the traditional landowners of the land that we're standing on today, but also the land where I'm conducting my research, which is the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. And I will be talking a little bit about the integration of physical activity into young people's substance use treatment and the aspect of shared intervention design. My co-authors, unfortunately, are not here today, so it's my role to take over the presentation. I'll talk a little bit at first about problematic substance use in young people and physical activity. I will then give a little bit of an overview over my own research, which has 3 phases. The first one looks at the research evidence. The second phase looks at young people's expertise, and phase 3 is currently in progress, which is developing recommendations based on the research. And I will then talk a little bit about outcomes, conclusions, and key suggestions for research and practice. And if you come across the words PA or SU on my slides, they mean physical activity or substance use. So about my background, to explain why I'm doing the kind of research that I'm doing, I trained as a clinical psychologist in Europe and did my master's placement at St. Vincent's Private Hospital here in Sydney. And I then went on to work with young people who are dealing with problematic substance use in Germany, and then switched to conducting my PhD on young people with problematic substance use and physical activity in Melbourne. So when we talk about problematic substance use, what are we talking about? So the definition of problematic substance use is substance use that causes health, social, legal, or other issues for young people. And problematic substance use, especially in this population, can lead to impairments in key life areas, which then can lead to poor social and health outcomes throughout the life course. Problematic substance use generally affects 1 in 6 young Australians, which is quite a lot if you think about it, and usually comes comorbid with mental illness, high-risk behavior, and suicidality. And we now know that while the initiation phase of substance use is usually during adolescence, the peak age of problematic substance use is actually during young adulthood and early adulthood, and the most affected population is young people aged 15 to 25. Yeah, problematic substance use usually peaks before the age of 27 overall. So physical activity intervention. There is generally natural decline of physical activity during adolescence, which can be reinforced additionally by substance use. So it declines even more, basically. And research evidence has already shown that there may be a beneficial effect of physical activity interventions for substance use reduction, both in adults but also in this population. And we talk about, when we talk about physical activity intervention in setting, we talk about all kinds of approaches that lead to increases of physical activity among a certain population. And it's important to acknowledge that these approaches are not just behavioral approaches, but they can also be cognitive approaches, informational approaches, societal approaches, environmental approaches, and policy approaches. For example, an informational approach could be physical activity messages or physical activity promotion via, for example, posters or something like that, or So since I trained in Europe, but then did my placement in Australia, I kind of like, I was in a very beneficial position of like being able to compare specifically, for example, Australia and Germany when it comes to both physical activity in young people with problematic substance use, but also generally their approaches to substance use in young people. And what I've noticed is that there are quite a lot of differences. For example, Australia follows more of a harm reduction approach in young people with problematic substance use, and Germany follows more of a zero tolerance approach, so aiming to get them to not use any substances at all. Australia focuses more on voluntary admission. Germany, unfortunately, I very much agree with that, focuses very much on involuntary admission, hospitalization. And Australia focuses more on a health-driven approach versus Germany, for example, focuses more on a criminal justice-driven approach in this population. But what I've noticed is that one of the things that those two countries had in common was that there's predominantly no integration of preference-driven physical activity in routine care for young people with problematic substance use within the public health sector. Obviously, there may be private health establishments where this is possible, but within the public health sector, it's predominantly not happening. And what I was wondering is there's guidelines and recommendations for a variety of non-communicable diseases when it comes to physical activity and physical activity engagement, but for some reason, not for substance use, specifically not really for young people involved with problematic substance use. So the right to health is not granted to many people who use drugs, which was the response of the International Society of Substance Use Professionals to this year's World Drug Report. And my argument is that we should go beyond that because it's not just the right to health, but it's also the right to physical health and inclusion that is not equally applied to many people who use drugs, especially young people. And as I mentioned, there's guidelines and recommendations for so many non-communicable diseases, but not for substance use, and particularly not for young people involved with problematic substance use. So based on that, basically, my research looks at the integration of targeted physical activity into young people's substance use treatment. And I was particularly interested in the research evidence, but also young people's insights. So the research had three phases. In phase one, I looked at the existing research evidence. In phase two, I consulted with young people, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And phase three is developing recommendations for clinical practice based on these insights. Looking at the research evidence, I conducted a systematic review and included any physical activity intervention for the age group 12 to 25 years. Any physical activity intervention that also measured substance use outcomes, and I also explored physical activity outcomes and mental health outcomes. And as additional data, I looked at behavior change techniques that were used in these physical activity interventions, and any kind of implementation data, information on how they implemented it, for example. And I identified 28 international studies of various intervention formats. Some of them were more short-term interventions, some more long-term, but there was a definite beneficial effect of physical activity interventions on substance use reduction in this age group. And I also noticed that there was a significant underreporting of implementation characteristics as part of these studies. And these implementation characteristics, for example, implementation barriers, but also facilitators basically, are actually really crucial to be able to translate and implement effective interventions into practice. In phase two, I started off by conducting quantitative surveys with young people. I should mention this was still in the phase where it was quite uncertain if we were going back into a lockdown or not. Everything had to happen online, basically, because of that risk. I recruited young people via online social networks, community groups, and student services. And young people were eligible if they were aged 16 to 25 years, based on the concept of mature minor. If they were involved with problematic substance use, which I defined as a moderate or severe risk of experiencing health or other problems because of their substance use. And it was a help-seeking population, so they either needed to have prior engagement with health services, or they needed to express willingness to engage with clinical services in the future, because obviously we wanted to investigate the acceptability of physical activity interventions in a population that would potentially actually use these services. So this is just a little bit of an overview of the online questionnaire. I basically did screening for age, substance use, and their willingness to engage with cognitive services. And I assessed nicotine dependence, mental health, their current physical activity engagement, and also the treatment acceptability of a physical activity intervention that aims to reduce substance use. And I also assessed exercise benefits and barriers that these young people were experiencing. And the outcomes showed that young people found physical activity-based interventions very acceptable as part of substance use treatment practice. They found it very appropriate and also perceived it as effective for helping them reduce their substance use. And I had an immense amount of 94.9% of young people who also expressed a willingness to engage in these kinds of interventions as part of the substance use treatment. And I should note at this point, obviously, there's a certain selection bias because participants self-selected into the study, which we need to acknowledge when we look at the incredible acceptability of these interventions. A little bit about my participant characteristics. So 77% were at moderate risk of experiencing health or other issues because of their substance use, which would often be called substance abuse. And 23% of young people were at severe risk, which falls more into the area of substance dependence. Most of them were female, 72% were female, 22% were male, and 6% identified as other. And the results also showed that there was a significant negative relationship between the experienced barriers, treatment acceptability, and physical activity engagement. So the more barriers to physical activity engagement young people experienced, the less they found this kind of treatment acceptable, and the less actual physical activity engagement they reported. I also found a positive relationship between the amount of benefits they experienced and the physical activity engagement. So the more barriers, the more benefits they experienced, the more their own engagement, and a negative relationship between mental health and physical activity barriers. So the poorer the mental health, the more barriers young people experienced, and the lesser benefits in physical activity engagement young people experienced. Significant barriers that were named in this research were that physical activity obviously involves a lot of time, it's hard work, and it's particularly problematic if there's no family or partner encouragement when it comes to it. But young people also acknowledge that it improves mental health and mood, and it gives them a sense of accomplishment and control. I then conducted a focus group with young people aged 18 to 25. They also reported problematic substance use, and the focus group was 2 hours long. And we followed a campfire approach, so very laid back, very welcoming kind of atmosphere where everyone could say what they wanted to say. And we also did some online brainstorming as part of the focus group, and it was analyzed via a qualitative content analysis. So just a few example questions that were asked in the focus group. For example, how could an ideal physical activity treatment or program offered by a health service look like for you to want to participate in it? And another example question was, how would the treatment offer feel to you if your experienced barriers are overcome? Would it make it more likely for you to engage in the treatment offer? This is how the brainstorming, like an example for the brainstorming. So young people were basically given prompts and were then able to use online post-it notes to basically just like give their thoughts to those prompts. And this is the overall outcome of the focus group, and I will talk in more detail about this. This is just, I felt, a very beautiful graphic. So the results showed that young people clearly favored highly tailored interventions. They expressed needed supervision according to the treatment stage. So early on in the treatment, they favored supervised physical activity. Later on, they felt that they didn't need that anymore. They favored clear directions when it comes to physical activity. Interventions that are led by passionate clinicians who are motivated about physical activity. And they also really pointed out the need for social connection as part of physical activity interventions and informative education. So actually learning about the positive effects of physical activity for substance use reduction. They also identified clear barriers, for example, around substance use, social barriers, but also the lack of knowledge on how to use physical activity to help them better manage their substance use. And other barriers they identified were vague recommendations. So, for example, visiting a health service and a GP saying, oh, just do more physical activity, but not really giving any more advice or directions beyond that, and sometimes inappropriate treatment models that are being offered by health services. So the conclusion is that physical activity may be beneficial for reducing substance use in young people or helping them manage their substance use, and it's perceived as highly acceptable and appropriate by young people. They are able to voice clear preferences like highly tailored interventions, passionate facilitators, clear directions, but there's also a lot of service needs that would still need to be addressed. For example, the fact that young people feel that they would need organizational support, they would need additional engagement aids when it comes to physical activity interventions, they would need decision aids. And one of the things that kind of stood out was that they also pointed out that they really need continuous progress checking, and I guess this is also related to this particular population of young people who are involved with problematic substance use. So they actually favor having a treatment team continuously checking on their physical activity progress and making sure that they're on track. So key suggestions are obviously much more research is really, really needed. The important thing is if we are to develop these kinds of interventions, we really need to include young people as partners and key stakeholders. And it was mentioned in one of the presentations before that co-design is just really crucial in this area. So co-designing policy and interventions and also conducting more focus groups. Is really important that, especially in this population, we are having non-stigmatizing open conversations and we're following a health-driven approach because, after all, problematic substance use is not just a criminal justice matter, it is a health matter. And young people do have the same right to physical health as anyone else, basically. And really need to focus on increasing access and reducing barriers. So, for example, actually establishing additional collaborations between schools, universities, and health services. And I just want to point out at this point that when I talk about these potential physical activity interventions that we could implement, a lot of people often think about like comprehensive, large-scale interventions that need a lot of funding, obviously, that we often don't have in the public health sector. But a lot of the preferences that young people expressed, basically, for example, clear directions, or more information on how physical activity could be used for helping them manage their substance use. A lot of these things could be readily implemented in existing services without actually needing any additional funds if clinicians just kind of like took the extra 5 minutes to address these things. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Lee. I think there's lots of common themes around the ability to build in low-cost